The problem was the switches, not the processor, not the memory, not the case it came in. The problem was that if you spent $397 in January 1975 and ordered the machine advertised on the cover of Popular Electronics, what arrived in the mail was a metal box with a row of small toggle switches on the front panel. And if you wanted that box to do anything at all, you had to enter every single instruction yourself, one switch at a time, in raw binary machine code, with no keyboard, no screen, and no software of any kind to help you. In the last episode, we followed the Intel 8080 processor, the more capable successor to the original 4004 that Ted Hoff, Federico Fagan, and Stanley Mazur had built to solve a Japanese calculator company's arithmetic problem. We ended with a promise. That chip was about to end up at the center of a machine called the Altair 8800, and that machine was about to create an industry nobody at Intel had been building it for. This is that story. Micro-Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, MITS, was not, in 1974, a company anyone would have picked to launch the personal computer industry. MITS was based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and had been founded years earlier by an Air Force veteran named Ed Roberts, originally to sell electronics kits to hobbyists, model rocketry telemetry equipment at first, and later, more successfully, electronic calculator kits, riding the same wave of falling chip prices that had squeezed Busicom in the previous episode. MITS's calculator business had been profitable for a few years in the early 1970s, but by 1974, the calculator market had become exactly the kind of brutal, margin-collapsing price war that squeezes out smaller competitors, and MITS was, by Roberts's own later account, close to bankrupt. Roberts needed a new product, and he had a specific idea about what it should be. A computer kit built around a microprocessor, sold to hobbyists the same way MITS had sold calculator kits, unassembled at the lowest possible price, to a market of electronics enthusiasts who would put it together themselves, and Roberts hoped, by the accessories and expansions MITS could sell alongside it. The processor question was central to whether this idea was financially possible at all. Intel's 8080, released in 1974, was a significant improvement over the earlier 8008, but it was priced, in small quantities, at around $360 per chip, a price that would have made a $397 computer kit mathematically impossible before you'd bought a single other component. Roberts negotiated directly with Intel for a bulk price, and the number that came back, reportedly around $75 per chip, for a large enough order, was what made the entire project financially viable. That negotiation is a small, easily overlooked detail with an outsized consequence. Without a bulk discount roughly 1/5 of Intel's list price, the machine that became the Altair likely doesn't get built as a hobbyist affordable product at all. The machine that resulted, Roberts and his small engineering team, working through the second half of 1974, built a computer around the discounted 8080 processor, with 256 bytes of memory, an open expansion bus that let hobbyists add their own boards, and a front panel of toggle switches and LED lights as the only means of input and output. Was named the Altair 8800. The name itself has a small, disputed origin story that's worth pausing on, because it says something about how casually this entire invention was treated even by the people building it. According to the most commonly told version, an editor at Popular Electronics, the magazine that would put the machine on its cover, asked what it should be called, and someone in the room, accounts differ on exactly who, suggested Altair, reportedly after a Star Trek episode in which the Enterprise traveled to that star system. It was, by every account, a casual, almost throwaway decision, made by people who did not yet understand they were nomming the machine that would be widely credited as the device that started the personal computer revolution. Popular Electronics put the Altair 8800 on its January 1975 cover, under the headline "World's First Mini-Computer Kit to Rival Commercial Models," and the response overwhelmed MITS almost immediately. Roberts had hoped for a few hundred orders that might keep his struggling company solvent through the year. He received thousands, from hobbyists across the country who had never had access to an actual computer before, and were willing to pay $397, plus assembly time measured in days, plus the toggle switch programming that would follow for the chance to own one. What those thousands of buyers received when their kits arrived was a computer in the most literal, minimal sense possible, a functioning central processor connected to memory capable of executing instructions and absolutely nothing else. No keyboard, no monitor, no storage device beyond the memory chips themselves, which lost their contents the moment the machine lost power. No operating system, no programming language, no software of any kind, because no software for this machine existed yet anywhere, for anyone to buy. To make the Altair do anything, to make it add two numbers, to make it blink a specific pattern of lights, to make it do anything at all beyond sit there drawing power. Its owner had to write a program in the 8080 processor's raw machine code, translate that program by hand into binary, and enter it directly into the machine's memory by flipping the row of toggle switches on the front panel, one bit at a time, for every single instruction, and then read the machine's output. If it produced any at all, from a corresponding row of blinking LED lights. This was, by any reasonable modern standard, an almost unusably primitive way to use a computer, and it was exactly as tedious as it sounds. Hobbyists who bought the Altair in early 1975 spent hours accomplishing what a modern computer does in a fraction of a second, and did so entirely through their own manual translation of intention into binary switch positions. But it was, for the first time in history, a genuine computer that an individual person could own outright, sitting on a desk in a private home, belonging to nobody but them. Not a university, not a corporation, not a government laboratory. That fact, more than any specific technical capability the machine possessed, is what made the January 1975 magazine cover matter. Paul Allen saw that magazine cover, or heard about it from someone who had, in the winter of 1975, while working as a programmer in the Boston area. He brought it to Bill Gates, a friend from their years together at Lakeside School in Seattle, who was in his second year at Harvard. Gates and Allen had known each other since high school, where they'd both spent an unusual amount of teenage time getting access to computer terminals through a local company that let students use its computer time in exchange for finding bugs in its software. An arrangement that had given both of them years of hands-on programming experience most adults in 1975 didn't have, on machines that, unlike the Altair, were large, institutional, and shared among many users through remote terminals rather than owned outright by any one person. What Gates and Allen recognized, looking at the popular electronics cover, was not that the Altair itself was a remarkable machine. By the standards of the institutional computers they'd already used, its toggle switch, no software state was primitive. What they recognized was the specific gap the magazine cover made visible. Thousands of people were about to own a genuine computer with absolutely no software to run on it, and the first company that gave that computer a usable programming language would have a business with, for a brief window, effectively no competition. The two of them contacted MITS directly, telling Ed Roberts that they had a working version of the basic programming language, a language originally developed at Dartmouth in the 1960s for teaching programming to students on shared institutional computers, that would run on the Altair. This was not, at the moment they made the call, entirely true. Gates and Allen had not yet finished writing it. What followed was roughly 8 weeks of work, through February and March of 1975, writing and testing a version of BASIC for a machine neither of them owned or had ever physically touched. because no Altair existed yet outside of MITS's own offices and the small number that had already shipped to customers. Gates and Allen worked instead on a simulator, software running on a large, institutional computer at Harvard that was programmed to behave, as closely as they could arrange, like the 8080 processor inside the Altair, letting them write and test their basic interpreter's logic without physical access to the actual hardware it was ultimately meant to run on. This was a specific, high-stakes bet, that their simulation of the 8080's behavior was accurate enough that code written and tested against the simulator would actually function correctly on real Altair hardware the first time it was tried, because a trip from Boston to MITS's offices in Albuquerque to test it in person was not something either of them could arrange more than once. Paul Allen flew to Albuquerque in March 1975, carrying a paper tape with their basic interpreter encoded on it, to demonstrate it on an actual Altair for the first time. By most accounts of the demonstration, the program worked essentially on the first real attempt, a validation of weeks spent testing against a simulation rather than the real machine, and a result that could easily have gone the other way, given how little margin either of them had for a hardware mismatch they had no way to detect in advance. MITS licensed the software, and Gates and Allen founded a partnership to develop and license it further, initially under the name Microsoft, a hyphenated combination of microcomputer and software that would later drop the hyphen and become one of the most valuable companies in the history of the industry. The detail worth sitting with here is not that Microsoft became successful. That part of the story is well known, probably the best known part of everything covered across this entire series. The detail worth sitting with is what the company's founding problem actually was, and how narrow and specific it was compared to what it eventually produced. Gates and Allen were not, in early 1975, setting out to build a software industry, or to define what an operating system or a personal computer would eventually become, or to build a company that would still be central to global computing 50 years later. They were solving one specific, narrow problem. A magazine cover had just put a genuine computer into thousands of hobbyist homes, and that computer had no programming language anyone could use to make it do anything beyond toggle-switch binary entry. Writing a working basic interpreter for the Altair, fast enough to be first, was the entire ambition. This is the same pattern that has run through every episode of this series so far. Bardeen and Brattain weren't launching the semiconductor age in December 1947. They were proving Bell Labs' post-war reorganization under Mervyn Kelly hadn't been wasted money. Kilby wasn't inventing the technological foundation of the next 60 years in July 1958. He was solving a wiring problem informed by a decade spent thinking about hearing aids. Ted Hoff and Federico Fagan weren't setting out to invent the microprocessor as a category in 1969. They were trying to give a Japanese calculator company a cheaper way to build several models without redesigning chips for each one. And Gates and Allen, in the winter of 1975, weren't building Microsoft as it exists today. They were racing to write one specific piece of software for one specific machine before anyone else did. In every case, the problem actually being solved was narrower, more commercial, and less visionary than the eventual consequence of solving it. That gap between the specific, unglamorous thing someone was actually trying to accomplish and the much larger thing that solving it turned out to enable is the thread this entire series has been pulling on, one invention at a time. The Altair itself did not survive long as a commercial product in its original form. MITS was acquired in 1977, and the specific hardware platform that had briefly been the center of the hobbyist computing world was quickly overtaken by more capable machines. The Apple II, the Commodore PET, the Tandy TRS-80, all released within roughly a year of each other in 1977, in what came to be called, only somewhat after the fact, the 1977 trinity of early personal computing. But the Altair's role as the specific device that had made those later machines commercially conceivable was not diminished by how quickly it was overtaken. It had proven, in the most direct way available in 1975, that there was a real hobbyist market willing to pay real money for a computer they could own personally, a fact that had been genuinely uncertain before thousands of popular electronics readers wrote checks for the January 1975 issue's cover machine. And it had produced, as a direct consequence of that hobbyist market's existence, the specific commercial pressure that led two college-age programmers to write the software that became the founding product of Microsoft. Bill Gates left Harvard without finishing his degree to work on Microsoft full-time, a decision that in the context of 1975 looked, to most people around him, considerably riskier than it looks in hindsight. Paul Allen worked alongside him through the company's early years before departing in 1983, following a cancer diagnosis, though he remained a major shareholder and continued involvement with the company for years afterward. Ed Roberts, the MIT's founder whose bulk price negotiation with Intel had made the entire Altair project financially possible in the first place, eventually sold MIT's and left the computer industry entirely, going on to attend medical school in his 40s and spending much of the rest of his life as a rural physician in Georgia. A career change about as distant from Silicon Valley mythology as it's possible to make, for a man whose company's magazine cover had, by most historical accounts, done more than any single other event to launch the personal computer industry as a mass consumer category. The popular electronics cover that started all of this, the one Paul Allen either saw or heard about in the winter of 1975, is not remembered today with anything like the reverence given to Bell Labs' December 1947 transistor demonstration or Kilby's July 1958 notebook entry. It was a hobbyist magazine, selling a build-it-yourself kit to an audience of electronics enthusiasts who mostly wanted a fun, challenging project rather than a glimpse of the future. Nobody involved in producing that January 1975 issue believed, at the time, that they were about to trigger the sequence of events that led directly to a company now worth trillions of dollars. The vacuum tube's heat was the problem in 1945. The wiring between components was the problem in 1958. A calculator company's need for cheaper, reprogrammable chips was the problem in 1969. And in early 1975, the problem was that thousands of people were about to own a genuine computer with no way to tell it what to do. Solving that last problem, narrow, unglamorous, and undertaken by two programmers in their early 20s racing against a deadline, they'd essentially invented for themselves, by telling a customer they had already finished something they hadn't, is what put a usable piece of software into the hands of the first wave of people who ever owned a personal computer, and gave a 50-year-old company its start. What happened once ordinary people, rather than hobbyists willing to toggle switches by hand, could actually sit down and use one of these machines. That's a different kind of story again, and it's where this series goes next.